Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into if the people of Gaza are finally turning against Hamas. Let's get started. These sounds that you are listening to are thousands of Gazans coming out into the streets and protesting against Hamas, calling them terrorists, demanding they put down their weapons, demanding even that they've given back the hostages in order to end this war. This is something you don't usually see. And frankly, if you watch mainstream media, you will literally never see it because it doesn't fit their narrative. You won't see this on CNN, MSNBC. You sure as hell aren't going to see it on Al Jazeera. But what are these protests? We see the Gazans coming out, and sure, they're saying that they hate the Hamas people and what they're doing to the area and the lifestyle they're living. It seems on its face to be a very genuine protest against the oppressive regime, the people who have kept them down. Since these images and videos were hitting social media, I've heard from many of our followers about what my take is. And frankly, I've heard a lot of influencers who have said very different things on this topic. And so this week, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in these protests, my take on what they symbolize, and also, I guess, in a way, an update on the whole conflict and ceasefire situation. At first, when the protests started coming up, we heard from a lot of influencers, people who I guess are in the know or at least are very opinionated on the conflict, calling these out as fake, as Hamas propaganda. Some people made a very good claim for why it's very likely that Hamas was behind these protests as a way of showing the international world, look, we're over the October 7th celebrations, we've learned our lesson, trust us, now we hate Hamas. So get Israel to leave us alone, give us our little state that you've promised us, and totally we will give up the terrorism. Trust us. And those commentators made a very interesting point that this could just be another tactic of Hamas to throw the world off this idea that they're terrorists and that they should be fought until the end. And one of the biggest claims by these people who suggested this idea is, where's Hamas? Why are they allowing thousands of people to go into the streets? Hamas rules with an iron fist. They should be out there killing people, taking people to jail. It must prove that Hamas is involved somehow. It wouldn't really be the worst idea and the worst plan to pretend that Hamas is kind of already gone so you can give up on the whole war thing. We're reformed. But one thing that I found that didn't seem to fit with this theory is a few things. First and foremost, you will notice that everything you are seeing on social media from these protests are not from Hamas traditional sources. As an example, someone very astutely on social media pointed out that none of the footage that you are seeing that does make its way to mainstream media says obtained by CNN, by MSNBC. It says obtained from either a person's name, from a cell phone camera, or very often uncredited because these people who are taking this footage don't want to be murdered by Hamas. If this was legitimately Hamas propaganda that was pre-planned, why aren't we seeing the official PR sources that they typically use? Lord knows that we know they have plenty of very high-quality cameras. We saw them during their parades of hostages on stage, their GoPros, their drones. They have a much better production value than what we are seeing right now. And if this was part of their plan, why wouldn't they use these pro cameras and put it through their typical channels of Al Jazeera and other places? The fact that it's not being filmed by Hamas, edited through Hamas channels and sent through Hamas journalists, I use that in quotes, proves that it's more likely an actual protest, not sanctioned by Hamas. And another very big thing that some people will claim is proof that it is part of Hamas's plan is the fact that they are not cracking down on it. How are they allowing these thousands of people to speak out against them in the streets of Gaza? They rule that area with an iron fist. However, to people who maybe remember not that long ago, we saw this play out last time. If you remember the podcast we had done a number of weeks ago, when the ceasefire finally went into effect, and what happened after that, Hamas in their nice fresh uniforms came out and started beating, killing, and arresting anybody who dared speak up against them prior to the ceasefire. They were hiding in a hole because they didn't want to be killed by the Israelis. So unfortunately, they couldn't come out to stop the protests. So they waited for a ceasefire to then come out and kill anybody who spoke against them. So it is more likely that is what we're seeing right now, is when these protests are happening, it's not because Hamas is allowing them. It's because Hamas knows that Israel is still flying drones all over the area in order to track down where these Hamas members are going and coming from. If you haven't been aware, Israel's been doing a pretty good job for the last week of taking out pretty much any Hamas terrorist that is still above ground. So I imagine many of the Hamas leadership, who would love nothing more than to put down these protests, were probably sitting in their tunnels, scared shitless to come out and be taken out by the Israelis. And with this vacuum of no Hamas members above ground, it leaves the people of Gaza to be able to openly express their views in public without any kind of fear of being hurt. Ironically, it is the Israeli presence in Gaza that gives the Gazans the freedom of speech without fear of being killed by Hamas. And I think my theory was proven right, because a couple of days later, after receiving all of these messages from our followers, sure enough, Hamas, I guess, couldn't stand this anymore. Maybe they did a rock, paper, scissors and sent some of their guys out into the town squares to shoot off their guns and scare people into no longer protesting. Maybe they were watching the news and realizing how much this was being covered and how bad it looked on them. So they had to go and risk their lives in order to break these up. They couldn't stand for this happening, or, God forbid, enough people coming together to actually throw Hamas out. We did see this similar thing happen following the Israelis entering Lebanon, where during the ceasefire, the Lebanese locals actually went after the Hezbollah fighters and kicked them out of their towns. So maybe Hamas is fearing that they would be next if enough people come together in opposition to Hamas. And further proving my theory correct, we've seen over the last few days, Hamas has been forced to come out into the light of day and has started to crack down on their protesters. We have heard endless stories of people in Gaza being kidnapped, taken for torture, and some, unfortunately, even killed. Even today, the day I'm recording this episode, reports coming out of Gaza, not from mainstream media, mind you, are reporting that 22-year-old Gazan activist Odeh Nasser al-Rabai, who took part and may have led some of these anti-Hamas protests, was tortured and killed by Hamas terrorists attempting to maintain control over their region. Something you will never hear in the mainstream media. What you will hear endlessly on mainstream media right now is the way that the world is so hopeful for another ceasefire. Maybe we're going to have another ceasefire. Hamas has agreed to the Egyptian ceasefire. They have twisted the story from what they're actually doing, which is murdering their own people in the streets in order to maintain control, while pretending these are the peaceful people who are just wanting a ceasefire. But they don't just want a ceasefire because they're so peaceful. They actually want a ceasefire because of the same reason I said they wanted a ceasefire a couple of weeks ago. Because Hamas is terrified. If you listen to our old episode from a few weeks ago, Hamas is terrified, you'll get a little more info on that, but things have gotten ramped up big time recently. In our last episode, we talked a little bit about how Hamas was ready to fight again because they turned down the last ceasefire attempt, the Steve Witkoff American plan to keep the status quo, the release of hostages for aid and so on. They turned it down because they believed they were ready to fight. And clearly within less than 2 weeks, they realized we were not ready to fight. Or maybe they underestimated the Israelis. I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard from various sources that the Israelis, when pulling out during the last ceasefire over 2 months ago, they had actually put down secret microphones into Gaza in order to track troop movements and knowing where everybody is without having to use drones, something that's against the ceasefire. And either due to this or just incredible intelligence, they have been able to pick off leader after leader after leader in a week and a half, killing dozens of Hamas leaders. And Hamas, who thought they were ready to fight, realized we are getting destroyed and we need to stop this fighting immediately. And like I said in my last podcast, once Hamas is getting to the point of destruction, they look to ceasefire. They look to give up a few hostages to give themselves more time to regroup, more time to get ready for the fight, and they are desperately wanting that right now. Israel has proven to have taken out so many of their leaders, they are in a desperate need for a pause in the fighting. But in addition to that, the protests are also causing the problem. As I said earlier, Hamas can't keep control of Gaza while they're hiding in tunnels. The people above them are able to unite and actually kick them out of power if they wanted to. And with Israeli drones everywhere, and with them able to take out the leadership in a moment's notice when someone comes above ground, Hamas desperately needs Israel to ceasefire so they can come above ground again in their nice, fancy, clean uniforms and go and kill a few of their own people to maintain that control that they need. So the ceasefire is not only because they want Israel to stop killing them, it is also because they are losing control of their own region, and soon enough, the people themselves are going to rise up against them. The desperation of Hamas right now is abundantly clear. According to the reports, the Egyptians have attempted to broker a deal, and it's apparently been agreed to already by Hamas because they are so desperate to temporarily end this conflict. The Egyptian deal would suggest that Hamas wants to release 5 hostages now, some alive, possibly some dead, in order to have a break until the end of Passover, so call it a few weeks. Of course, they added the caveat that they're going to hopefully negotiate the, quote, end of the war, which to Hamas means them maintaining power. That used to be called Phase 2 back in the old days. Israel, however, does not accept Hamas's suggestions and wants 10 hostages returned, not 5, and has no intention of talking about, quote, ending the war, because the war will not end until Hamas is either destroyed or gives up power and leaves. So time is going to tell on whether Hamas is going to be so desperate to just accept sort of anything that Israel says. As I've said in the past, the hostages are kind of the only thing Hamas has left, so they don't give them up easily. So thinking 5 hostages or 10 hostages makes a very big difference for Hamas. That's 5 less people that they can use to maintain control in Gaza and hold Israel back. In the end, it'll be interesting to see how Hamas deals with this whole ceasefire issue. They are desperately needing a pause in fighting for their own lives, but also to maintain the power and keep oppressing their own people. If you listen to our last episode, I finished last week's episode with a quote from former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, who told a BBC journalist that it is only by starting these wars again that Hamas actually is willing to give up hostages. And it seems like he was incredibly accurate, because in a matter of 2 weeks, Israel's pressure and taking out Hamas has forced them in no time to want to get back to the table and have a ceasefire deal, despite the fact that they thought they were ready for another months-long war. It is exactly this pressure that causes Hamas to release hostages, not sitting back and hoping that they just change their mind and wanting to release hostages. And for anybody who is watching these protests and thinking, well, this is a new day, and that the people will overthrow Hamas and kick them out and life will be great, I really hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is not what's happening right now. The people of Gaza are very uneducated, thanks to the UN and their own organizations that make sure they are uneducated, but they're also very fickle. The people of Gaza, unfortunately, only care about this moment in time. They never seem to think long term. They think, what is causing me an issue right now? The issue right now is Hamas torturing and killing its own people and also bringing war to it, which they don't like. The back and forth of moving people north and then having to be kicked out because the Israelis are going back in because the ceasefire's over, they are done with this type of thing. But don't get me wrong, the people of Gaza, if the Israelis left today, would be more than happy to have Hamas back. For one reason, because Hamas will make sure that anybody who speaks up against them will be killed. So that's one reason to support Hamas. But the other reason is because Hamas will promise them to rebuild, they'll do better, they'll take on the Zionist entity, they'll kill the Zionist Jews, they'll do another October 7th, and the same people who cheered on October 7th for the great success of Hamas will support Hamas in their goals of doing another October 7th. It is what is important to the people right now. And right now, Hamas is a problem. When Hamas is not a problem, and Hamas supports them a little bit, and Hamas is taking some of the international aid to rebuild houses and hospitals and whatever, in addition to tunnels, the people will love Hamas, and they will support Hamas. It is the same cycle over and over again, which is why Israel is trying so desperately to get rid of Hamas and put a different government in place that will not use their money for terror, and let the people of Gaza understand what a real, peaceful, safe life could look like. Something they've literally never had before because of their own governments. So when I started this podcast about whether or not the people of Gaza are actually standing up to Hamas, the answer is, for now. But the minute that Israel is gone and that the Hamas people come back and whip them all back into shape, I can guarantee you these people will be quiet, these people will be subservient, and not only that, they will blame Israel for everything and support Hamas in their next attack against Israel. So it seems like Israel is going to have to do the Gazan people a favor and eliminate Hamas as an option for the future, for their own best interest, because clearly they can't make that decision themselves. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.